But we all have to sort of remember that it goes back to one app at the end of the day. So having the same principles that we use across can really help with something like that. And then it also helps you to design, communicate your design intents. So explaining that why when people are questioning your design choices, or when you're presenting to clients and teammates and stakeholders who may not have that design heavy background. It also helps support creativity. So even though some people think that having rules can sort of put too much restriction on creativity, it actually does in a way help to free that up, because you're not starting from scratch. You already have a structured foundation, and so you can use that as a base to sort of start exploring and innovating in more meaningful ways while still sort of staying anchored. Cool. Here are some common examples. So on the left is sort of what you would get taught in design school. These are more sort of rigid rules. So design, considering your design hierarchy, the balance, the contrast, these are sort of the key things that you would get taught when you first start doing your design foundations. However, in service design on the right, these are examples of the principles that you would sort of create in a project. So for us, we always have a principle around user-centeredness, so that we can build our journeys based on the conversations that we've had in our research phase. Co-creativeness, maybe if a collaborative approach is a really big part of what we're doing, we will mention something about participatory design, where we bring the people that we were interviewing into the design process to ask them questions to help guide them on giving their ideas and their input into what we're designing. Sequencing a lot as well. So for example, when I had a project that I mentioned last week, where we were designing a call center system, one of the key things for us was being able to guide the sales agents when they're solving customer requests, so that they aren't sort of starting from scratch, so that the experience is sort of consistent across different customers, and so that they can focus more on being in touch with like the customer's emotions, with helping, if the customer is panicked about a card being lost or something, helping them calm down, and they don't necessarily have to think about the routine things, and having that built into the system so that it's already there. Evidencing can also be another one where you use artifacts and quotes to ground journeys in real life. So if there's something that really came up through your design research and synthesis as the key common thought, being able to design a principle around that to make sure that when you guys go into the detail of now unpacking what the requirements for whatever you're designing are, that you are able to bring that sort of guideline into the process, so that you don't forget to design for that thing. Because I know at the beginning, before you start designing very complex things, you always think, I'm going to remember that. But once you go into the process and different people start getting involved, you're now engaging the different stakeholders and institutions that you've mapped in your ecosystem map. It is very easy to sort of forget what was done in design research and just really want to get out, okay, these are the journeys and these are the screens and wireframes that accompany them, and this is the product that we're building. So having that be part of your principles is good. And then something around how holistic your design is can also be a good principle. So thinking about how do you show emotion, how do you show social, logistical, and institutional consideration in your process can also be really, really good. And so, yeah, these are sort of some examples. They aren't always like this. You are allowed to be a little bit more creative, be a little bit more free, but it does help just to note these down with your team, just to say, okay, if there are 6 things that are going to be the most important for us that we bring into every single playback, just to sort of help set the tone for the room, what are those going to be? And everyone sort of co-creating, so you guys can prioritize, because all of these things are always going to be important, but depending on what you're designing, some are going to be more important than others. If you guys are for example, working on a graphic design project, how it looks is going to be a lot more important. So some of those common design principles are only really relevant to more visual things, whereas if you're more looking at designing an experience, the principles for that are going to look completely different, and are going to be more about who you engage, how you engage them, when you engage them, and what matters to those people that you're designing for. Cool.
Cheers, man.
But the tips with this is just don't sanitize or clean up the messiness of what you're designing, because a lot of the things that we do design are complex. So going forward into the next step, which is looking at user journeys, always make sure to consider that you are allowed to bring in a little bit of your thinking, and it's not always going to look perfect and clean. And the same goes for your design principles, is you can always highlight that as well, so that you can remember that, okay, with our design here, a key principle is, you know, we want to keep what we're designing very real, and you can define what that means for you guys. And there also are a few other resources which will be more relevant as we go through the rest of the deck, but that you can read on sort of how you use these different artifacts, your personas, your archetypes, your principles, and your journeys in order to develop your in-state service or product. Cool. So we'll come back to this. Right, the next part is looking at what exactly is a user journey. So the first one is just a key description that you guys can look at to better understand going forward. So a user journey is a descriptive or visual narrative of the process, experience, actions, and emotions that a person goes through when interacting with a product or service or system to achieve a specific goal. It maps out the chronological sequence of steps, highlighting the person's motivations, various needs, and emotional states at each stage. So yeah, as we go through, I think this class and the next one as well, you guys will start to understand this a bit more, especially once you guys start to practice doing it in real life. The key components typically of a user journey is a persona. So even though we design archetypes, what we want to do when we now go into the design process is to sort of humanize it a little bit more. I think a lot of you guys were already doing that in the last class, where you would give it a name and then give it a persona after that. So saying Lerato, the tech skeptic, or whatever. So bringing that element in and then designing a scenario, which is around a specific task or goal that that person is trying to achieve. The next one is around the touch points, so being able to map out the physical or digital points of interaction with that experience. So when exactly do they receive a message? What is the channel that they do that on? When exactly do they go into a store and interact with a person, and what happens at that point? And then being able to map the actions, which is the next step, which is around the steps that a person takes in pursuit of their goal at each of those touch points. So that's also included. The next one that we usually have is to bring in more of an emotional aspect. So what is the person thinking at each of these steps? What are they feeling? Their emotional state at each of those steps, as well as any of the barriers. So being able to pinpoint what are the pain points or systemic obstacles that the person could interact with, because even though we want to design a perfect journey, the reality is usually what we're designing for is sort of rooted in a reality. So it's not always going to be because we are designing this process, because we are great designers, it's going to be perfect at each step. There could be certain things that, because of, I don't know, tech restrictions or financial implications, where we have to sort of put a step in that is a little bit challenging, or that could cause drop off because it is a bit long or complicated. So being able to point that out so that the stakeholders are well aware that, you know, maybe in future stages or iterations of this product, we need to also think about how we solve for these dips in the process. And then that's where you sort of bring in your opportunities. So these are the areas of intervention or service improvement or innovation, and that could happen in the design process. So sometimes when we are designing these things, we are asked to do a as-is journey and then a to-be journey. So mapping out what is the current process. If the customer already has that product built, we will go talk to customers like you guys have done in research, and we'll take note of what the journey looks like. And then we will design that into end state to sort of say, okay, currently at this stage, your customers do this manually, and then they call this person, and then they have to wait to receive an SMS where they click, and then it goes back to them, blah, blah, blah. In the new journey, everything is going to be automated from the start. Information is preloaded. Customer just logs in online, and then, they can talk to a chatbot, which doesn't have such a long downtime. And so being able to map those differences is also sometimes something that we do. So you're able to show where did we make changes and where are opportunities for future iterations to sort of improve the customer journey in order to get to that end state or North Star that everyone is working towards. And so, yeah, the reason why we would use user journeys is because it's a sense-making tool, right? You want to be able to translate your qualitative research into actionable insights, because with the work that we sort of have done previously, a lot of the time you'll get the question from stakeholders, asking, so what? Like, what does this actually mean for what we're trying to solve? So being able to say this is the research, a lot of them already feel like they know a bit about the research because, yes, they've seen the customer complaints on their reviews, or they've heard people say that it's very inefficient. And then we show them archetypes to say, okay, now we're understanding your users, and they're like, this is great. Now we have a clearer picture, but how exactly does this translate into the product or service that we're trying to create? So being able to now bring it into a journey is sort of where you start to really bring it to life, to sort of map everything so that they can actually see how does that research, how do those different personas sort of now experience the product that you're either going to design or as it currently is. And it sort of translates everything, making it easy for everyone involved in the project to understand. So I found that in my experience, the user journey is the one thing that everyone is able to look at. So when the tech teams now start designing the sort of user stories, they look at the UX task flows and they look at the customer journey, and everything sort of has to map to each other. When the stakeholders want to understand what exactly are we designing and how does it work, they look at the user journey to sort of say, okay, these are the sort of key steps that someone will follow, and these are the different phases of awareness of the first interaction, engagement, and the post-service engagements or whatever. So being able to map that is very helpful. The second one is around the surfacing of invisible systemic issues. So with the customer journey, again, taking into consideration something like the ecosystem map, where you're looking at not just the person that you're designing for or your end user, but you're thinking about all of the other people that they interact with, all of the other stakeholders that have an influence on that person's experience. We're looking at all the different institutions, the processes, tools that have an impact on that person's experience. And having that view when you design the customer journey, you always take that into consideration. So if we are if we've done our research, we've done our personas, we've done our ecosystem maps, and we now come to the conclusion that, okay, for certain products, people don't make decisions alone. They make decisions as a group, or they're influenced by word of mouth very heavily. When you design the customer experience, and the first step is sort of your awareness. So how does the person hear about it? And the discovery, where do they go to go learn more about it? You're able to now surface those key insights to sort of say, okay, at this step, we've designed it that we're going to have a social media push, and we've considered sort of the word of mouth and how we're able to impact what that narrative is like. Here are the reasons, and here are sort of the systemic invisible forces at play here. And so being able to bring that in can also really, really help. It also helps to bridge organizational silos. So because a customer, when they are especially interacting with a service, they're not interacting with one part of the business or one tool alone. When you are designing a journey, especially as a customer experience designer or as a service designer, you're able to bring all of those different silos together. So if we are saying we're designing a tool that helps to streamline, for example, how people set appointments, in a typical experience, you're going to be going online, you're going to be going in person, but you will be talking to a receptionist who usually is completely divorced from that specific practice that you're visiting. Let's say it's orthodontistry, which has its own receptionist as well. And then internally, they have their own systems. So it is sometimes in organizations, you'll find that all of these different people don't necessarily speak to each other. There's people who track data and metrics. There's people who manage the applications. There's people who actually provide the service. There's people who actually talk to customers. And all of these people can be sort of operating on their own processes. And so being able to create a journey where you're like, okay, the customer, when they walk in, this is the first person they interact with. This is the tool that they are introduced to at this stage. And then they are referred to this department where they now fill out this form. And these are the people that they give it to. And this is the person who then provides the service. It helps everyone sort of then come together and see and align on a single view of the customer experience in order to streamline their different processes. Fourth one is around aligning stakeholders with the shared understanding of the user experience. So again, I think it speaks to everything that we've discussed before, with the fact that you want to make sure that everyone has a single view. So not just the people in this, for example, hospital, since we're speaking about hospitals, we're not just talking about people in the actual hospital. There's always like a management layer above that who aren't actually in the hospital, who could be in offices, you know, the net care officers, for example, whose job it is to think about the business, to manage the finances, to do other things. And then there's people who are maybe from other organizations where the tech build of some of these products or the implementation of it is outsourced and things like that. So being able to have an artifact like this helps all of those people align on what exactly they are doing, and then they can sort of adapt it to their specific use case. And the finance person can take the journey and say, okay, in order to enable this, where do we need to unlock more funding, or where can we sort of think about how we incentivize people, or any technical upgrades, how will those impact the experience, and therefore use that to prioritize internally what they want to implement first or in that year. And then the last one is to stimulate co-creation and empathy with real users and not just rely on assumptions. So one thing that I love to do when we do have the opportunity is we'll usually print out the journey on a big paper and just have it in a room. And we'll be able to invite users to come in and say, so this is the journey that we're thinking. Here are some sticky notes. Go in and actually write things that you would love to have in that process, or that you think are missing, or that you think should be removed because they add additional strain or additional steps in your process that are unnecessary. And being able to have that end-to-end visualized journey can really help everyone sort of be able to see what this would look like and can facilitate that co-creation process. And so it is quite an important tool, and I think it is really, really helpful. And so going forward, I think having this brief that we spoke about in our first class can really help sort of everyone in this class anchor on the same thing, right? So just to make it a little bit more practical, we're going to use this sort of contextual brief to help us design for the same thing. And so it's around accessing public health services in a South African urban township, right? So the research team, which is us, was taught us understanding how people in South African townships navigate and experience public health services. And the goal here is just to improve the experience, communication, and systems design for these services. And so in the past class, we spoke about sort of understanding the profiles of people that were interviewed, their backgrounds, their employment statuses, to understand sort of their behavior and how they feel about the current process. And so now we are going to look at how we bring that into a user journey. So before we get into it, first we have to understand the step-by-step process that we need to get there, right? So if we take a persona, let's say Zanele, and she's a single young mother of two and an informal worker, we have to first define the scenario, right? So because we now understand all of these different behaviors, all of these different pain points, when designing a journey, you want to account for the key scenario. So one thing that we'll usually do as a part of our process of research is we're not going to just research or talk to the users of the product. So in this case, we're not just going to talk to people in the community and potential patients. We're also going to talk to the staff. Sorry.